I have hosted the recital dinner at Thornmere Hall every autumn for 11 years, and I can tell you honestly that not one of those evenings prepare me for the night the groundskeeper sat down at my Bosendorfer. The evening had started pleasantly enough. 30 guests, the best of my wife's china, candles on every surface. I had engaged a pianist, a competent young professional from the city whose name I have since, embarrassingly, gotten. But he had telephoned that afternoon with car trouble and a profuse apology, and I had managed to absorb the news with what I hoped was the face of a man untroubled. We would have a fine dinner regardless. Conversation would carry us. It usually did. What I had not absorbed quite so smoothly was the presence of Hartwell. Desmond Hartwell was a music critic of the national broadsheet variety, the kind who reviewed Wigmore Hall on a Tuesday and dismissed the effort in 4 cutting sentences on a Wednesday. My wife had invited him, not I, and he had arrived with the particular energy of a man who has never once entered a room without believing he was the most qualified person in it. He was already holding court near the fireplace, rearranging the canopies on his plate with a fork as though conducting a minor audition. When I noticed the boy, Eli Crane had been working on the grounds at Thornmere since September. He was one of those lean, sun-darkened young men of 24 or so who seemed to have arrived from somewhere, without quite saying where, do the work thoroughly, and keep out of the way, and ask for nothing extra. Shh. He had come in through the tradesman's entrance to collect a set of ladders we had stored in the outer hall, and somewhere between the entrance and the ladders, he had lost his way, or perhaps he had not. He was standing at the edge of the drawing-room doorway, still in his work jacket, looking at the Bosendorfer. Not the way most people look at an instrument they've never played, with vague curiosity, the way one looks at a piece of furniture. He was looking at it the way a man looks at something he recognizes, something that belongs to him in some older, unregistered way. I saw Hartwell notice him. "You, lad." Hartwell turned from his group with a thin, delighted smile, the smile of a man who has spotted an opportunity for mild sport. "Since we appear to be without a pianist this evening, you'd apply just with something plain and unobtrusive. Fill the gap before we go into dinner." There was a brief pause. One or two of the nearer guests turned to look. Someone stifled a smile. Eli looked at Hartwell, then at the piano, then he crossed the room, set down his jacket on the bench beside him, and sat. I should have said something. As host, I was positioned perhaps 15 feet away, and I watched with a helpless, suspended feeling as Eli adjusted the bench, rolled his sleeves to the elbow, and placed his hands, unhurried, ceremony, on the keys. He began with Satie, the gymnopede, the first one. I recognized it after a few bars, and I imagine half the room did too, and I think half the room exhaled slightly at the recognition. Something manageable, something gentle and well-known, the musical equivalent of keeping it plain. The conversations did not stop immediately. People still murmured and shifted. Hartwell turned back to his group and said something low that produced a quiet laugh. The Satie continued. 3 phrases, 4, spare and unhurried, notes placed carefully, like stones set in water. And then, without any break or announcement, without a pause to signal that anything was about to change, the music altered. Cannot explain it better than that. It altered. The harmonic structure of the gymnopede seemed to dissolve and reconstitute itself into something else, something wider, something that had the Satie's quietness in it still, but also something raw underneath, like land seen from above, like a river moving in the dark. It was original. I understood that almost immediately, the way you sometimes understand things before your mind assembles the proper words. He was no longer playing Satie. He was playing something that came from the same impulse but had been somewhere further and returned with more to say. The first conversation stopped, then the second. I watched Hartwell's group go quiet mid-sentence. The music moved through something I can only describe as a kind of grief that has made its peace. Not a weeping grief, but a clear-eyed one. The grief of someone who has looked at the full size of the world and decided to love it. Anyway, it built, not with the thundering drama of a concert showpiece, but gradually the way weather builds, the way light changes so slowly you can only see it has changed by looking away and looking back. By the time the room had fully stilled, I suspect none of us could have said precisely when the silence had arrived. It was simply there, entire, though the 30 of us had agreed to it without speaking. My wife, Eleanor, had come to stand beside me. I felt her hand find my arm. The music rose. It broke open somewhere in the middle passage into something almost unbearable, and that is the word. I know it sounds excessive, but I mean it precisely. There was a moment where the sound filled the room so completely and carried so much of something wordless and true that it sat on the edge of what one could hold. I heard a sound from across the room that I believe was Margaret Holt, 73 years old, the most composed woman I know, and I did not look, because I did not want to see her face and then have to manage my own. Well's fork was on the plate. His plate was on a side table. He was standing with his arms at his sides, not moving, looking at the boy at the piano, with an expression I had not seen on Hartwell's face in the years I had known him. It was not admiration, exactly. It was older than admiration. It was the look of a man who has just been reminded of the reason he entered his field in the first place, and is perhaps not certain whether to be grateful or undone. The music began at last to resolve. It came down from what it had built slowly, with the same patience it had used to rise, until it found its way back, not to the settee, but to an echo of it, a memory of those first careful phrases, transformed now into something that had been changed by the journey between. The final chord was quiet, 2 notes left to decay. They lasted a very long time. Then there was nothing. No one moved. No one spoke. A log shifted in the fireplace, and I think 1 or 2 people flinched at the sound of it. Eli sat with his hands still resting on the keys, looking down at them, as though waiting for something he could not quite hear yet. It was Margaret Holt who started the applause. I had been wrong. She had not made a sound during the playing. She had been absolutely still, and now she was clapping with her small, fierce hands, and there were tears on her face that she was not troubling to wipe away. The applause spread around the room in the way that real applause spreads, not all at once, not staged but person to person, each one rejoining the world from wherever the music had taken them. Eli stood from the bench and retrieved his jacket. He did not bow. He looked briefly at the room, not with pride, not with nerves, simply with the open and uncomplicated expression of a young man who had done the one thing he knew how to do and was now returning to himself. Hartwell crossed the room. He walked through the guests without excusing himself, without looking anywhere except at the piano and then at Eli, and he came to a stop 3 feet in front of the boy. He said nothing for a moment. Then he put out his hand. Eli looked at it and then at Hartwell's face. He shook the hand, that was all. No words. None were needed, and Hartwell, perhaps for the first time in his professional life, did not try to find any. I have thought about that evening many times in the years since. About what it means that the music came from the tradesman's entrance, that it came in a work jacket, that nobody in that room had thought to ask whether it might. We had 30 guests, excellent china, candles on every surface. We were as prepared as we had ever been. And the thing that made that evening what it was walked in looking for a set of ladders. The hired pianist, as it turned out, arrived after dinner. He was apologetic and very able. Nobody asked him to play.